Hello, Galo. I'm super happy to be joined by you today, which Vivian and I, with Folifistla, we were here 2 weeks ago. And at the end of our interview with Haden and Deborah, we announced that we would love to have you next. So it's really great that you're here and we're able to talk on the Architectural Informatics Society channel. So first, let me introduce you. So please, everyone, welcome Galo Canizares. I'm trying with the pronunciation. He's a designer, writer, and educator. His work blends absurdity, genre fiction, world making, simulation, and parafiction to address issues in technology and the built environment. He is the recipient of the 2016 and 17 LeFevre 29 Emerging Practitioner Fellowship, and in 2018 he was awarded the Christos Yessios Visiting Professorship at the Ohio State University. His writings have been published in various journals, and he's the author of Digital Fabrication, Designer Stories for a Software-Based Planet, which we're going to hear about today also, a collection of essays on software and design published by Applied Research and Design. And his collaborative architectural practice, Office CA, won the 2018 Ragdale Ring competition. Thank you so much for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much to you both for the invitation. Really excited to be here. Okay. All righty. I'm all set up. Great. So I wanted to start with this phrase, everything is software. This phrase is something that I've been throwing around for a couple of years now, and it really summarizes the approach to my architectural research in that I'm really interested in the development of software after the rise of digital culture and how it basically is kind of engulfing all aspects of life. Everything is software for me is a kind of epistemological phrase that crosses everything from the technological to the social, to the cultural, to the ethical, and everything in between. And I think that architecture is very interesting in its relationship to software because we use it all the time and we kind of take it for granted, but it consumes a lot of our discussions and a lot of our thinking and obviously a lot of our labor. And so for me, this has been a really productive site for research. The phrase everything is software is sort of a take on Software Takes Command, which was a book by Lev Manovich, a media scholar, where he's writing about how software has kind of taken command of cultural products for example, in digital art, or just the fact that images are now the primary medium for communicating cultural artifacts, 3D models, etc. Things like Photoshop, all of this is taking command of culture. And so I build a lot off of Manovich's ideas. And when it comes to the built environment, I'm really interested in this sort of tension here in software, right? So in the everyday, thinking about our interactions with software in situations like getting a coffee and not being able to get a coffee because the software in the coffee maker is glitching, or something like a toothbrush that has artificial intelligence, right? I'm interested in identifying what values are embedded in these kinds of artifacts and what decisions are, how decisions are made that go into the production of these everyday objects. Things like showers that have Wi-Fi, right? Shower heads that have Wi-Fi. How is technology affecting the everyday experience of domesticity, for instance? And then when it comes to architecture, I'm also interested in how software is viewed by architects, right? How the debates that we have about how we use software, how best to produce work, and how the kind of politics of corporate software also operate. And in a way, the language that is used in software is also incredibly powerful. Things like words like infinite canvas or something like that becomes a really interesting phrase that becomes almost like poetic or philosophical. But again, it is used just to describe an app or a piece of software. And then, of course, the way that we talk in everyday life using words that come from software, like the word Photoshop, right? The word Photoshop is a verb, but it's also this corporate label, right? It's a trademark. Adobe basically says you can't legally say the word Photoshop without saying, you know, Adobe Photoshop software or something like that. There's this disclaimer that legally Adobe owns the word Photoshop, but we use it every day. And so that tension is also a really interesting site for exploration. You have interesting instances of language that pop up when someone says, no, this image is not Photoshopped. It's we used a different software, but everyone knows that the word Photoshop actually means to digitally manipulate now in everyday life, right? You know, part of my research also deals with this idea of using the digital as a kind of cultural signifier, right? So the phrase Instagram in real life may seem kind of absurd, but I think it's a testament to how much software has kind of engulfed our the way that we look at the world around us, right? Instagram is a kind of lens, and so now we refer to pictures sometimes as Instagram in real life, right? And of course, I would also have to mention Zoom when it comes to this interest in kind of the quotidian digital. Zoom has also sort of engulfed our life, especially in the past year. And there's some really interesting effects that come out of being immersed in Zoom. So all of this is to say that my research is really is pretty broad ranging, but it really focuses on these kind of targeted instances where the digital sort of bleeds through the everyday and creates absurdities and creates weird nuances that would only be able to exist in a world where everything is software. So when we inhabit that kind of lens, we can look at, for example, this installation by Virgil Abloh, and we can think of this as a rendering, right? A kind of a real life rendering or a real life clay model or something like that from a software such as Maya or something, right? Or an installation like Daniel Asram's piece here that also suggests the kind of aesthetics of a digital rendering, right? It seems like artworks now start to reference the digital, even if no digital devices are involved in the making of these artifacts, right? And it affects the way the artists deal with materials and the way that they deal with image making, obviously, space making. And it's, even though these pieces may not have been conceived digitally, we can conceive of them as related inherently to a world where everything is software, right? We can create connections. When it comes to architectural software, there's also this tension between state-of-the-art innovation or innovative research and the normalizing of really advanced tools, like as filters, for instance, right? So on the one hand, you can see that there's really advanced research happening in terms of the development of machine learning software, artificial intelligence software. And then on the other hand, companies are trying to monetize that instantly, right? So at the same time that there's this really advanced research going on, people are trying to make everyday tools using that innovative technology. So Snapchat filters, Photoshop effects, all of that kind of stuff becomes instantly available. And so, how do we argue for really advanced machine learning when some might argue that the end goal will just be a kind of cool effect, right? And so, what else is there in the world of software? And how do we as designers how do we deal with the here? This is what's called a kind of user-friendly machine learning interface, runway ML, which is geared towards creators. And so on the one hand, you have very advanced, scientific research going into interfaces that are supposed to be, quote, user-friendly. And so all of this, all of these questions and ideas that I've just mentioned are explored in depth in my recent book, Digital Fabrications, Designer Stories for a Software-Based Planet. It is a collection of essays that asks these types of questions and doesn't really provide too many answers because it's still a kind of work in progress. This is a compilation of essays and some piece of fiction that addresses digital culture from a designer point of view, and really, I think situates my research in between, let's say, media studies and architecture and technology studies, and it sort of crosses a lot of disciplinary boundaries. It's not a very technical book. It's written in a very accessible way so that we can talk about these things. We can talk about memes, or we can talk about video games, or we can talk about Photoshop and all of the tools that frustrate us, but also aid us in the work of every day. And so in the book, there's these diagrams that try to make sense of the world of software. I argue that the world of software is so convoluted that we need to map it, especially for people that are entering the world of design and are just presented with a million opportunities to work in different ways, right? Do they work with vectors? Do they work with pixels? Do they work with video games? Do they work with animations? Do they work with machine learning? Do you work with 3D printing, right? There's so much software out there. And I think everyone is sort of struggling to, let's say, orient themselves in this world. And so I provide a couple of suggestions of how to begin to map this world according to either things like passive versus active users, media that has human qualities, or media that's geared more towards computational qualities. For example, a difference between like human and computational might be something like big numbers, right? So any media that deals a lot with big numbers, processing spreadsheets, I would say that that's more computational. Whereas things like Photoshop filters or painter brushes in Photoshop are more sort of human-oriented qualities, but they're all, again, packaged into software. And then the last point that I'll address in terms of my research is this idea that technology is social, right? So all of what I've been talking about is very much a kind of sociological perspective on technology, and I really try to make the argument in both my teaching and my practice that technology is a social endeavor. I use the term techno-social a lot, so that we can think about people and at the same time that we're thinking about technology, right? This idea of software being a vehicle for labor, sometimes it's extractive, sometimes it's sinister, right? And we need to bring that to the surface. It's not just playing around with Photoshop. Software can be used for sinister aims. and in a way, it also ties into the processes of imagination that architects are super engaged in, right? We are in a discipline that is tasked with imagining the future. And so when we think about the future and we think about technology, we need to think about the role of technology in with people, right? Like the sort of engagement of technology, and at the same time, the engagement with people, and making technology something that grows and evolves with humans, not just to achieve sort of novelty or to achieve some kind of a futuristic imagined future for the sake of novelty. This is also a really nice example that I found in an old textbook. The kind of effects of technology, the social effects of technology are very evident when a computer crashes, for instance. And here in the 80s, you have an example of a CAD operator who had this stress ball that was literally called the CAD blaster. So when their computer froze, they would throw this stress ball at the computer in order to relieve the stress. And then I've also been looking a lot at old user manuals for computing systems to see how computation is described to the general public. Right, there's a lot of really interesting diagrams that come out when you're trying to communicate the logic of computation to the general public. Things like scrolling, become really interesting as a kind of design exercise. How do you describe scrolling? How do you describe the space of the screen? All of this is a really interesting project, and even recently, I've seen animations that refer back to this idea of scrolling and the skeuomorph, and how computer interfaces actually do have some kind of interesting metaphysics that comes out when you think about like the internet as a spiritual universe, or when you think about let's say the space of a screen as a kind of mirror world to that of the real world that we inhabit. And so sorry, just trying to fast forward through. I'll probably end here. This is something that's really again highlights the intense social effect that technology has. So there was this one episode where Adobe had to cancel all software subscriptions in Venezuela last year because of an embargo that the US had with Venezuela, and because of subscription-based software, nobody was able to do any work on Adobe Creative Suite in the country of Venezuela. And if that doesn't show the power of software, then I don't know what else, what does. Thanks.
That was a great introduction to your interest and your research, Galo. I'm wondering if with the same strike of like one after the other and jumping from ideas to ideas, maybe that's, the rhythm of contemporary digital culture. I know you as It's Galo, which is, I would say, your avatar or your online identity. And I really wanted to see if you can talk more about your interaction as an architect, as a pedagogue, with Twitter, with talking about NFTs, talking about the politics behind academia and architecture, talking about building painting software, digital painting software, and building peopling, which is the new thing that you've been working on. So I'm wondering if you can take us a bit from like the theoretical realm of everything you've laid out to convince everybody that this is what we should be doing, to moving to what you are producing and how you're engaging as a pedagogue and an architect with the world today.
Yeah, I think that was the kind of question that I was running into myself. Do I present my work? I'm not really that interested in kind of showing too much of my work because it's available online. And so I like to take these opportunities to talk a little bit more theoretically about what I do. but essentially, everything kind of comes down to me practicing what I preach. So if I'm talking about software and I'm kind of critiquing software in a way, I also want to be able to make software. And so for the past couple of years, I've been engaging tools that that can help me make software so that I can provide really in-depth examples of some of the themes that I'm working on. So for example, for the space, ideas about like the space of the screen, and our perceptions of pixels as kind of the new normal. I've started to build painting software that really exaggerates some of the effects. It makes pixels sort of chunky and materially visceral. And so I've been making these painting apps that call attention to the pixel in really interesting ways, almost architectonic ways, right? Because my training is as an architect. I've also been working on a series of collaborative web apps that allows you to connect with other people, just anonymous people online, and draw together on the internet. That was a project called Our People Our Paper.space. And it's still live. You can go and whoever's logged in, whoever's like accessing the site, you can see their cursor and you can sort of engage with people across the internet in a way that maybe is a little bit different than other kind of collaborative softwares like Revit or something that is geared towards productivity. I'm really interested in making apps that are not productive or useless in a way, just so that they can be used for other means. In terms of my kind of online presence, I think that's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I've been making different accounts that now are more specifically curated. So when I first started Instagram, I was just posting whatever. And I think it's only recently that I've started to separate some ideas as they start to mature. I think social media is actually a really interesting venue for having really interesting kind of targeted discussions. So I'm kind of in a lot of different spaces at the same time. I'm in the kind of architecture social media. As you said, I'm also in like NFT social media. I got into non-fungible tokens earlier this year, and there's a really interesting movement there. And then obviously there's I'm also an academic, right? I'm an educator, a visiting assistant professor at Texas Tech, and so I also engage with other academics online in different ways. So I think what's nice about social media is that, yes, obviously there's a kind of toxic dimension to it, but I think for me, I've been trying to figure out how to make it productive in the best way that I can, so that it's not something that's super frivolous in my mind. I think it is something that people can engage with rigorously, I think. And not in a kind of monetary way, like influencers or anything like that, right? I mean, I'm just looking to have like really good discussions with people that whose work I really like, or whose ideas I really like as well. And I've gotten to meet some really interesting people. A lot of like really established artists all of a sudden, and I'm now talking to on Twitter, and it's crazy. This wouldn't really be available if I just like showed up at a gallery or something like that. I can't just talk to somebody, Yeah,
I love that aspect you brought up in your presentation, and I want to come back to what you said now about finding ways to be productive through your social media outlet. But before we continue on that point, when you were presenting and you started to talk about software is everywhere, everything is software, and you talked about how a software becomes, what I will interpret, but you talked about how a software becomes domesticated, and how instead of saying my coffee machine is a software, I just call it my coffee machine. And how instead of saying an ATM is a robot, I call it an ATM where I withdraw money. Instead of talking about a door that opens with a sensor, which is basically a machine vision thing, you call it just, automatic door. And there's all of these things that language has a way of domesticating complex thing into the norm and normalizing them through, associating them with domestic elements. So like a door has changed definition over time and has become more complicated, but somehow there is that domestication of software in order to be digested in a way. And that brings me to your other point about productivity, like you're finding ways to, you're thinking about how can I use critically social media in a productive way. And I want to come back to that productive, because I don't know if productive is, the correct word, because in what you presented, I saw like 4 different, I would say, category. One is understanding the digital as an aesthetic appeal, understanding the digital as bleeding into reality, but it's really about the aesthetics of the digital. The other is about the technicality of software, right? Like understanding, software as digital aesthetics. The other one is understanding software as technicality. So how do I build software? How do I get behind all of that technicalities behind building software, using software? The third one, I think, is one you would disagree with, which is how do I talk about software being monetized, like NFTs and so on. And then the last one, which you haven't brought up yet, which is, I think, how to use software in terms of interaction and entertainment, like gaming, doing game reviews, trying out games with friends online as an architect. And so how do you feel about the 4? Do they coexist? Are they different things that you're working on? How do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, those are really interesting, let's say, pillars that you kind of extracted. I think that there's a lot of sort of paradoxes, and I really enjoy paradoxes because they can be really productive to think about and to try to reconcile, even though they probably can't. But one of them is probably this idea of productivity, right? I think the word productivity in itself is kind of an interesting paradox, because we try to like, for example, in design, I think you can think of a lot of things as being productive, right? You can think of resting as being productive, right? Just taking a break or stepping back as being productive. And I like to think of, let's say, productivity as something that is inherently tied to just the goal of design, meaning that in order to, like, design is different from just art, right? Because design requires some kind of level of function, or some kind of addressing some kind of a function. And so there's always an inherent need to do something productive when you design. And for me, it's all about reversing what is typically understood as being productive, like this idea of like collaborative apps that are purely for entertainment or purely for just visual effect. And it's not an app that you're gonna design a building with. It's an app that you may take a break from designing a building to go play on, right? And so productivity, I think I like to use it in a lot of different ways, because it's almost like I like to say that I make useless software that is useful, right? Because it turns the idea of productivity software on its head, right? Think about what actually is productive in productivity software. Sometimes it's more stressful than anything else. I think the monetization of software is very, I mean, I think that's like a whole another, I think, discussion, much longer discussion, of course. Obviously we live in the world where we have to, we get paid for our labor, and we try to add value to the products that we make, for sure. And I think NFTs are a really good example of an attempt to add value to things that have traditionally been devalued, like, for example, digital artworks, right? I think digital artworks have for a long time been passed over because there's no way to really track how you the ownership of a JPEG or something like that. But now with NFTs, with blockchain technology, we can do that. And so I think that's why everybody's very excited about that, because now all of a sudden things that were devalued can now actually have their appropriate value. So I think value is something that is very, very important in design and art and a lot of other fields. But I worry about extractive kind of capitalist practices like subscription services, let's say monopolizing the software industry, that kind of stuff. Those are the kind of strategies that or phenomena that I'm kind of against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very clear. I love your idea of how you turn productivity or like useless, useful apps. Maybe, the last question is, since this kind of interview is geared towards students and listening, and you're a pedagogue, right? I'm wondering how, looking at students and Generation Z, and I'm wondering what draws students to this type of work? How do you convince them? Are they more interested in the aesthetics, in building apps, in NFTs, in building software? Like, what is the point that you can see as a really big shift in architectural education?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the most exciting sort of modes of engagement that I've had recently are these workshops that I've been running where I teach students how to code in JavaScript using the P5.js language, which is a kind of derivative of processing. So it's really popular for creative coding, and it's relatively young as a kind of programming language, and it's a really, really good introduction to the world of interactive scripting and just creative app building. And so I've been running these workshops where students design their own drawing apps. And what I've really enjoyed is hearing the feedback from the students that say, this is really liberatory, right? It's liberating because now I have control over something, right? It's not just, oh, I have to succumb to the whims of Photoshop, or I have to debug and something in Illustrator. No, you can make your own drawing app, and then all of a sudden you can give it your own spin, and you can personalize it, and you can create effects that you're interested in creating. And it's a really, really exciting to hear when students are start to think about that in those terms, when they start to think, oh, now I can code, and not only can I code, but I can also understand how code starts to work. And so then it starts to open up different ways of perceiving the built environment, right, as a set of rules. Or you can think about, like, all of a sudden now you can look at a door, like an automated door, and you can say, oh, well, that's probably an if then statement, right? There's probably some conditionals going on there, and I think that's really, really exciting from a kind of pedagogy standpoint.
Yeah, love that it changes the way they think about design, the way they're able to look at the world. It really adds a filter of alternative possibilities or alternative way of thinking about connection and networking of things. Yeah, that's great. I think it was super nice to have you. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, it's been super fun to hear about your practice, what you've going on. I suggest everybody to check you out online. You are working on a new book, if I understand correctly. And maybe a last sentence about this.
Yeah, I'm working on a book, still trying to find a publisher, but it's tentatively called A Software Consciousness, which is, it's a much more, I think this is going to be a little bit more serious than my previous one, which is kind of an assemblage of ideas. But this one really gets serious.
Exciting. Thank you so much for joining. And yeah, hope to hear more about your practice and to see how everything evolves. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.